incredible power of the Atari 520 ST. With the new Atari Discovery Pack, you can learn computer programming. You can discover talents you never knew you had. And create and play games as exciting as in any arcade. The new Atari Discovery Pack for less than £300.
Okay, the Atari ST. This is a 520 ST. It's an FM model, but it's not really the model that counts. They did quite a few different versions of the ST, and it was kind of a machine that I preferred to the Amiga. Initially, when this machine came out, it was a bit of a shock to the system because it was being kind of touted against the Apple Macintosh, and to be honest, this blew the Macintosh out of the water. It blew it away, and it blew it away in so many different areas, not just because it was less than a third of its price, and that was basically including a monitor. It had the same or more memory than the base Apple Macintosh. It came with more software than the Apple Macintosh did as a base machine, and it was a much better presented machine. It was actually faster, nicer to use. It was a revelation when you compare it to the Macintosh Classic and the previous version of the Macintosh, which was an awful, dreadful machine. And at the time, people who own Macs, they jumped on the Macintosh bandwagon and they slated this machine. They said it was rubbish, it was cheap, it was, you know, not fit for purpose and so on, which was a complete lie. This machine was much, much better than nearly every machine at the time when this was launched. Remember, it was launched before the Commodore Amiga. Now, speaking of the Amiga, this machine, the Atari ST, was really a Commodore machine. Not many people kind of realise that, because before Jack Tramiel left Commodore, they started to work on a 68,000 machine, and this is it. They didn't start working on the Amiga. Anybody who knows the history was basically that Amiga was originally from High Toro, and basically this was going to be where the Amiga was placed, because it was a Commodore designed machine. Initially, most of the specs were already Commodore, and it seems quite odd that it became Atari. And in a lot of respects, it is a much more rounded machine than the Commodore Amiga, and in a lot of respects it's also a much better machine than the Commodore Amiga. Now, I'm not knocking the Amiga because I like the Amiga, but this was the machine I actually wanted when it was out. It wasn't just because if it was the next generation machine, 16-bit and so on. It just offered so much more as a machine. The graphics on the screen were a lot more stable in standard resolution than the Amigas were. There was less flicker. The high res on this machine with the monochrome monitor was pin sharp, and that was something the Amiga kind of had to catch up to, really, when this first came out. But eventually, as we all know, the Amiga took over. The Amiga took over in the gaming market. The Amiga took over in just about every form of software over the Atari ST, which is a shame. But there was one saving grace with the Atari ST, and that was its MIDI ports, which we'll come to shortly. And the machine was quite a decent machine. 30 years on, or more than 30 years on now, most Atari STs still work. The basics of the machine is still good. It still works. It still does what it should do. The only downside or problem side for these machines tends to be the floppy drive, but then that's a problem for most machines. So what we're going to do is going to have a look at the Atari ST. So let's have a look at the aesthetics of the machine, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted it. I mean, it has a really nice design to it, and the function keys along the top are a nice touch, being offset, and there's a lot of nice neat design touches to the machine itself. This machine hasn't been retro-brighted. I mean, it's in its original condition, and I have 7 of these machines, and the reason I have 7 is because I've got quite a love for these machines, really, because of what they could do. The case design is really nice, and the keyboard, it looks very, very decent. The only downside is it's a little bit mushy, is probably the word you would use. It's very, very soft, but it does alright. It actually feels okay when you're typing. You can get used to the very short travel on it. It's also it feels kind of membrane-ish under the keys. But you know, it's not a bad looking machine, and overall it's quite a nice design. This is 30 plus years old, and it's hardly yellowed. There's a little tiny bit along some of these keys here and so on, but you know, it's nothing that a little bit of treatment wouldn't cure. But that's something I might do in the future when I finish off testing whether retro-brighting does damage to plastics or not, because I'm still not sure, and I want to keep these machines long term. So the mouse is something else. It's a ball mouse. It's what can you say about the mouse on this? It's different. It could be a mouse from a Macintosh if it just had one button on here. It's alright. It moves this cursor around the screen, and it's kind of alright in your hand. I think a child's hand, they would struggle with the size of it. But, you know, we're not stuck to these mice today anyway. You can use optical mice on these machines and just get a little adapter for them. But it's okay. I mean, it did the job. It's not the best, but it's definitely not the worst. These machines are quite well endowed. Printer, hard drive, external floppy disk, RF, monitor, a cartridge port, and the thing that made this machine a standout, you had MIDI in and MIDI out. And that changed the game as far as the Atari ST was concerned. Now the Atari ST came with, virtually, it was a version of GEM. I mean, it was called TOS, the operating system, or Atari operating system, or Trammell operating system, depending on who you actually spoke to. But the desktop itself was, for its time, it was alright. It wasn't quite as complex as the Apple Macintosh, because it came with literally what you see here: desktop info, which is TOS, graphics environment manager, and this is obviously 1986, 1987. You got your file manager, view, show your icon, sort by name, date, size and type. Very, very similar to what we see now on a modern PC. You've also got your options to set your preferences depending on your kind of monitor set, low, medium, high, etc. And then you've got your floppy disk, which is one of the quietest floppy disk drives in any machine that you'll ever use. And say this one's got basic in here. It's quite a big program, but it's more of a virtual graphical user style interface for basic, because you you type your commands at the bottom. This is what you see, and that's what you actually see as the output on small different screens until you use this run command, which it's a bit different, but you get used to it. It's not the most brilliant version of BASIC, but it does the job, and it does it quite well. So you can go from the emulator to load and save, to run, to edit, to debug, and then you've got your trace on and trace off, which is Tron. It allows you to track where the instructions are, at what part of the program the instructions are being executed, so you can basically just follow it through. So if we go back and see how quickly this desktop loads. And there we go, we're back to the desktop, and it's relatively quick. Obviously the other pointers are trash, obviously, because there's nothing in there. But the desktop is quite nice. It's still very intuitive. I mean, you flick between icons without pressing buttons and so on. And that's really about as much as you've got on here. So if we open this disk again, and it basically runs the programs very, very quickly. You've got expand your windows, same, scroll up and down on your windows, close your windows down a bit or completely close them. It's not a bad operating system, and it's certainly a lot less clunky than the one on the Amiga, because you remember the Amiga is a two-part system where you actually have to load in Workbench. It's not built into the machine, which gives this a bit of an edge over a Commodore Amiga. Now, one thing you'll probably notice is the image is quite bright and quite stable, and this is not using RGB or any other tricks or composite tricks. It's using RF, straight RF, and it is one of the clearest pictures under RF than any of the machines that we have, including the Amiga, and it's a nice crisp picture. It seems like they didn't skimp on the modulator that was built inside of this machine, and that was the other plus point. It didn't have a modulator hanging out of the back of the machine like the Amiga did, which makes it a nice neat package all in one unit. Literally plug it in, turn it on, and it works. And one of the other things that I really like about this machine is it comes with a decent manual. Okay, this is the one that comes with the Atari ST for the Discovery Pack, and it's almost like they still want you to know everything about the machine. For example, in the back of the book they still have some examples of BASIC that you can try and test and use on your machine. Also in this manual, okay, they go into a little bit of depth about the 68,000 chip, okay, which is what this is actually going on about, or trying to tell you about, the main Atari ST system. And it tells you things about the processor chip. Basically, it's fast becoming the industry standard. Part of the reason is that every successful chip is one of fashion. If a major company chooses a chip and it becomes successful, other people within the industry will use that chip, which is predominantly why they used it in this machine. And eventually the amount of literature, software and experience related to that particular chip is so great, they decide to produce the machine based on that chip. And that's their thinking around the producing a machine based on the 68,000. It's basically also says that the 68,000, if properly developed, has sufficient power to be favourably compared to mini computers of the late 1970s. So what they're really saying is a 10-year-old mini computer from DEC, IBM, ICL and so on has about the same power as this Atari 520 ST. Many computers cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds. This machine cost a few £100. So they're basically extolling the value of the microchip. But this manual goes through everything you could ever want really for this machine. And it's something that's lacking in modern day computers. You know, you buy a modern PC, it doesn't come with any documentation really. Windows doesn't really come with any documentation. You've got to do an online search and flick around and maybe Google things to try and find out specific items or specific parts of the operating system and how it works and so on, where they still tried to give you an overview, which was admirable really. So what's the specifications of this little machine here? I mean, I think the 520 ST badge says it all. It's got 512k of RAM, which kilobytes of RAM, or 1 megabyte if you upgrade it, which most people did. This one's got 1 megabyte in it. Display modes, it displays 60 Hz NTSC or 50 Hz PAL, and the resolution in color mode, which is kind of your normal 16 color mode on this machine, which is 320 by 200. It had a palette of 512 colors, and it has a medium resolution of 640 by 200, which was 4 colors, and a high resolution monochrome of 640 by 400, and that's for use with the Atari monochrome monitors. Now, the sound chip was the YM2149, and it's got 3 voices, 3 square wave voices, and it's got 1 voice of noise, which is basically, you know, for your sound effects, or to add white noise to, or even brown noise to other sounds that you're trying to produce. The drive is a single-sided 3.5-inch floppy disk, 500k capacity, and it's formatted to a standard 9-sector 80-track layout. So the machine wasn't bad at all, but the YM sound chip is the one that people kind of balk at, because it was exactly the same sound chip as used in other machines such as the ZX Spectrum Plus 2 range, the 128, the MSX and so on, and it wasn't deemed to be brilliant. But although it wasn't quite a patch on the SID chip even, or the sound chip, the Paula that was used in the Amiga, it still wasn't bad. It had quite a decent range on it, and it wasn't as bad as people made out. It was adequate, I would say. Although certain times it does sound Spectrum-like, but that's understandable. But the general graphics for games, etc., were not far away from the Commodore Amiga. And to be honest, most of the games were originally ported from the Atari to the Amiga, so there was very little difference in graphics or what people perceived as the capability of both machines. And it wasn't until people started coding directly for the Amiga was when there were differences kind of showed up. And such as this 3D Pac-Man, it's quite a good game, and it shows off some of the abilities of the Atari ST. Not just with the graphics, but also with what the sound's capable of doing. And as you can see, the resolution is quite high on this and it looks very good. The limited use of colours, they've done quite well with it. And to be honest, it's shifting quite a lot of pixels around on the screen and it's doing really well. And as I say, it's not as bad as a lot of people, especially if you were as kind of an Amiga file, would make people believe it was. Brilliantly playable and enjoyable games, which is really what a lot of people wanted out of a machine at the time. So this is my Atari ST, which I use for MIDI, and it's connected to a monochrome monitor. And other than the flickering, you can actually see how sharp the detail is on it. And the monochrome monitor does make a difference on these machines, especially when you're using MIDI software. They were also very, very good for desktop publishing and the like. And this is the Atari ST running Sonos, a sequencer for MIDI keyboards, which is something I'm going to go through at a later date on how this machine uses MIDI and how it became so popular and what you could do with it. But this is one of the reasons why you needed a high resolution screen. Although it was monochrome, it didn't really matter for either a lot of forms of desktop publishing, but it also didn't matter for things like MIDI sequencing because you didn't particularly need colour for it. Now the STE, the enhanced version of the Atari ST, added more capability. It added, a blitter chip, more colours, and so on, and it kind of brought it up to where the Amiga A500 was, but it was slightly too late because the Amiga had moved on to the A600 and then on to the A1200, which ultimately was the demise of the ST range, really. But really, in reality, that shouldn't have been the end of the story for the ST. And the ST lived on as a music or a MIDI system, and it did quite well in that, and it was used in a lot of sounds through the early 90s and the very late 80s, and a lot of people used it in recording studios, which we'll cover in a future episode. Was the Atari ST an also ran? I don't think so. I think the Atari ST actually was ahead of its game when it first was launched. It was launched before the Amiga. It had huge capability compared to the 8-bit machines that were out there, and it also had a bigger software base when it first launched, because Commodore was seen as a pariah in the sort of reseller industry at the time. People didn't like dealing with Commodore, but for some reason they liked dealing with Atari because they used a different strategy. The machine itself was good. It's quite reliable even now. There's very few faults with the machine, and with the addition of the MIDI ports, it made a huge difference to what the machine was capable of. I think today, seen as a platform on its own, it's got a lot more going for it than maybe the Commodore Amiga has or the A500 has, simply because of its capability and usability with MIDI instruments. It also has a lot of sequencing software out there, which is still good today. You can do everything you want to do on this machine with a MIDI keyboard that you can with a modern PC, which is staggering when you think about it. The graphics and sound were okay. The graphics were quite good. The colours weren't quite up to Commodore spec, especially in the original machine, but the later STE, they improved on it, and then it was on a par with the Commodore Amiga. I think that As a machine, the Atari ST is fantastic. It does everything that you'd probably want it to do. And it's just a shame that the fan base moved to Amiga and then onto PC. It's a kind of a piece of history now, and it's a piece of history worth preserving. And if you have one, use it. Play the games, enjoy them, have a bit of fun, because that's what these machines are also all about. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you subscribe, and I hope to meet you on this channel again sometime in the future, okay? Thanks a lot for watching. Goodbye.